Hi everyone! Welcome to your first chapter of Anatomy and Physiology. I look forward to discussing all the fascinating topics about the body with all of you this semester. The second semester is actually even more fascinating, in my opinion anyway, but all about the body is what I love to talk about, okay? So for my lecture videos, I will try to divide the chapter into two parts. That way you can always take a small break in between or have an easier time locating which particular concepts you need to go back to. So it's good to put down where part 2 of the lecture video begins on the slides so you know where to revisit those certain concepts again. Also, I always have a set of practice questions to go through at the end of the chapter. So make sure you follow through the lecture videos to the end for those answers. I will also, kind of talk, it's not just going over what's right or wrong, but I will also go over, explain a little bit why those answers are wrong or why some of the answers are correct, okay? So my best suggestion for you in making most out of these lecture videos is to either print the PowerPoint slides I put on eCampus ahead of time, or at least have them visible on another electronic device where you can take notes. It's, kind of boring to just listen to me talk. But being an active listener by taking notes, drawing concepts down, pausing the video when you need to digest the material a little bit before you move on to the next concept is always a good idea. Writing your own thoughts to certain concepts are what's going, all this stuff is what's going to keep you engaged with the material. It's just tough just sitting there listening to me talk. That's what's hard about online classes. So be sure to treat this as if it's an in-class lecture. Now, just sitting there having sound waves reaching your eardrums to get to your brain is just sound sensory information. We'll actually talk about that whole process in the last part of the semester, how sound wave can travel through your eardrum and then your brain can reset and sense that information. So, but in order for you to process the material, all your neurons in different parts of the brain need to be stimulated as well. Your vision, your logical thinking parts, your three-dimensional imaginations, because sometimes you have to think about, what happens if this part is located there, this part is moving, where are things traveling to? All of that imagination putting in through the thinking process is what's going to help you understand the material. Your memory parts as well, of course. Okay, we'll talk about actually different parts of the brain when we get to the brain chapter. What part of the brain will help you or in charge of, helping you process information and memorizing and remembering some parts. All of those, etc. Every part of your brain should be activated, not just your eardrums or your cranial nerve that goes for hearing, okay? But every part of your brain should be really focusing on learning the material and integrating it and understanding it in order to make the most out of this course, okay? So feel free to pause the video now to get everything ready. For example, printing your slides or having another setup of your electronic device where you can take notes, etc. Okay? All right. So let's get started. For the first chapter, we will go over 3 main topics as a first dip into anatomy and physiology. As with all biology classes, we always begin by talking about the hierarchy of structural relationships. You know how we said, things go all the way from atoms and then they move on to molecules, and molecules become organelles, etc. Okay, and organelles become cells, what makes up tissues, etc. So those goes all the way up to the organism level. So we'll go over that hierarchy of structural relationship again as part 1 of this chapter. If you remember from your general biology class, the hierarchy actually doesn't stop at organism level, but there's also population, community, ecosystem, and even biosphere. But that's what you will all learn about in General Biology 2 or Biology 1407 if you have to take that class or already having to, already have taken that class. But other than that, if you don't have to you don't have to take that class, then actually, probably that's the last you'll hear about ecosystem and all that stuff. Okay, so for this class's purpose, we will stop at the organism level because this is an anatomy and physiology class about humans. The second thing we will go over in this chapter is some key anatomical terminologies as a first introduction to anatomy. We'll emphasize some parts of this in your first lab exercise. We will gloss over what the basis of homeostasis is. And for 2401, we will only mention a few of these mechanisms. What we are preparing for is all that we will go over in 2402, which is all about homeostasis of every major organ system in the body. Okay, so that's why if you have heard that 2402 is easier, to me personally, that is a myth. Okay, it's more interesting and fun to learn because it's more about application, and you have that awe feeling like, oh wow, that's how it works. That's so cool. Okay, so it's kind of like that's how you feel with 2402, but it is definitely a more complex course than 2401 though. 2401 feels like every term and all these parts are being thrown at you. There's a little application involved, but 2402 is when the challenge really comes, but yet it is the most interesting. As when I asked my previous student, they all say 2402 is a lot more interesting than 2401, but it is a lot tougher. Okay, so be looking forward to that stuff. Okay, all right. Lastly, we will end the chapter with a variety of imaging techniques. Because you are taking this class probably because you're interested in health professions. Most people don't require, or most majors out there don't require anatomy and physiology unless you're looking into some sort of health profession field. And hence, that's why chapter 1 kind of goes over the different imaging techniques as well while we're on the topic of different planes and sections of the body. Okay? So these are some of the techniques that are commonly available for clinical diagnosis that we will be talking about as the last topic of this chapter. Now remember that all your science courses always begin by talking about this one thing, the scientific method. All right, so the scientific method, you've heard this a million times, okay, but we always have to begin by talking about that, which consists of 3 steps: proposing a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis with experiments, and lastly, collecting data through design experiments to make new conclusion. Easy way to remember, 3 words: hypothesis, testing, and conclusions. Okay, 3 simple steps of the scientific method. Okay, all scientific facts that have made it to your textbooks today comes from scientists going through this scientific method. No one imagined that this is how your body looks like on the inside. Biologists have gone through the scientific method millions of times to prove to the public that that is how your body looks like on the inside. Or even what exists in the cell. Who would know what's inside the cell just by naked eye? But yet scientists go through with different scientific method, okay, using microscope, using different methods to prove that there is something inside the cell that's moving around, that's making proteins, that's reading your DNA, okay? All right. So no one can just make up how the surfaces of your stomach or intestine looks like microscopically. It's all based on what one can actually observe, and that's what the scientific method is about, and that's how we are able to study and talk about anatomy today. I have had students that come into my anatomy and physiology class that thinks, this anatomy is just all about bones and muscles and body parts. That's it. So, it's easy. What many didn't expect coming into this class is that it includes both gross or macroscopic, okay, not that kind of gross, not kind of gross, but what I mean is macroscopic, okay, gross anatomy, things you can see with your naked eye, larger structures, and microscopic anatomy. Okay, so a lot of people expect the gross anatomy part, but not many people do expect the microscopic part. But we actually dive quite a bit into some of the mechanisms that are at the molecular and chemical level. Not only that, we actually look at a lot of microscope. Each organ system we will be studying always involves looking at the types of tissues at the microscopic level. For example, in Chapter 4, you will have to learn how to identify more than 20 different types of tissues by looking at pictures of them. Unfortunately, because this is an online class, you don't get to see the slides in person, so I will show you pictures instead. But you will have to know by looking at these pictures what type of tissue you're looking at. Is this from the spleen? Is it a type of epithelial tissue? Is it a type of connective tissue, etc.? So we don't just study what we can see with our naked eye, but we also will be studying a lot of things at the microscopic level as well. So for the gross anatomy part of this class, we will be studying some internal and external body structures and their physical relationships among other body parts. Now, this includes surfaces, regions, sections, systems, anatomy landmarks, and developmental changes. What we mean by developmental changes is how do some of our tissues grow from when we are fetuses, for example, from a little embryo. How do some of those things grow? For example, in Chapter 6, we will talk about how bone tissues are formed in the body of a fetus. How do bones go from nothing into something that solidifies over time? And also we talk about what happens to tissues when we grow older. For example, what happens to bones as we age. Okay, so that's kind of the central theme of the textbook as well, is that with every organ system it talks about, it always ends the chapter by talking about how things are formed and how things age when we get older as well. Okay, so for microscopic anatomy, this is when we have to look at cells or tissues of the body through a microscope, something we cannot see without the help of magnification of some sort of instrument that will help us with that. And there are 3 different main types of microscopy. Okay, if you remember from 1406, we already mentioned a few of these. Under the dissecting microscope, we can see larger structures, okay, or features like body parts of a fruit fly like this. Okay, if we want to look at their eyes, what color are their eyes, or the specific structure of their wings or the body, those are parts we can see only when we look under the magnification of a dissecting microscope. If you try to use a more powerful microscope, you're probably just going to see a blob because it's too big. Under the more powerful microscopes, and then with our naked eye is too small to see anything. So dissecting scope is perfect for looking at larger structures, for example from an insect or even preserved embryos. Okay, preserved embryos are really tiny, almost like a grain of rice, and we can't really see them with our naked eye, but under the microscope we can see little buds, okay, little tail of the embryo, etc. Okay, and under the light microscope is what we will be using a lot if we were in class, but I keep saying that we'll be using a lot of these in class because technically speaking, with all the tissues that we're looking at, all the microscopic work that we're looking at, it's all from the light microscope. Okay, we can look at smaller structure like different types of tissue, identify cell types. We can't see details of cellular organelles at this level. Now, don't get me wrong, because we can never see, little dots of ribosomes or like rough ER folding all over the cytoplasm. That is not something we can see under the light microscope unless you use some fluorescent dye to make those organelles light up. But well, what we're looking at, talking about the cell, is usually just the nucleus and maybe chromosomes if we're looking at cells during mitosis, during cell division. And they still have to be stained with a certain dye so we can see the nucleus or the DNA chromosome, okay? So in this particular example, it's showing a section of lung tissue. So this is, lung tissue. Okay, again, we'll be going over all the different types of tissues you need to look at this semester in chapter 4. But this is a section, meaning that a cross section where someone takes a biopsy of a lung tissue and then cut across it, lay it, and then they use an instrument, special instrument that takes slices of that piece of lung tissue and lay it flat on the microscope slide and stain it so we can see how it looks like under the microscope. Okay, so that's how light microscope is used to look at cells. Now, under the electron microscope is where things can look, very, very nice, because they can look, this is the most powerful type of microscope out of the 3. We can look at super tiny things like pollen grains, for example. This is what is showing you here. These are little pollen grains stuck on some kind of fiber or something. And or even sometimes molecules of DNA can be visualized using the electron microscope. It is the most powerful type of microscopy that enables us to see things at the atomic scale. Okay, so that's very, very small. But it is a very expensive microscope, unlike those light microscope you're used to seeing at and using at a school on a bench top. Those are cheaper ones, maybe somewhere around a couple hundreds of $1,000s. But if we're talking electron microscope, okay, these are very special, and you need a whole department to manage this type of microscope. One special type of electron microscope called transmission electron microscope can cost up to $100,000 each and can be 4 or 5 meters tall. Yes, 4 or 5 feet meter. 4 or 5 feet tall. 4 or 5 feet tall. That's how tall these instruments can be, not just those tiny things on your table. Okay, and that's why they're so powerful. They need that space to produce electrons in a sense, and those electrons will actually go through your specimen to create very, very detailed image of tiny things. Okay, so I have actually worked with all 3 types of microscopes, so if you have any curious questions about microscopy, always feel free to ask me. Okay, all right. So there are two main subdivisions of microscopic anatomy: cytology and histology. Cytology is the study of internal structure of cells. So easy the way to remember, okay, cytology, C. So that stands for cells, looking at cells. Histology, on the other hand, is examination of tissues. Okay, so that's why you hear a lot about histology. When people mention histology, they're looking at tissues. Okay, and a lot of times in medical or clinical diagnosis setting, you will see a lot of histology. Okay, so these are where we're looking at groups of specialized cells that work together. Okay, because that's what tissues is defined as: different type of cells coming together to perform specific function. Okay, we'll get to that in a bit. Definition of different types of levels of hierarchy of structural relationships. Okay. All right, so for the physiology part of this class, we will talk about this from the aspect of a cell. For example, the types of secretions certain cell makes. Okay, so in cell physiology, we'll talk about what happens inside the cell in terms of, for example, if it's a stomach cell, there are stomach epithelial cells that actually, inside the stomach, there are cells that make secretions such as hydrochloric acid. Okay, there are cells that make enzymes. Okay, so those are some chemistry we will go over inside the cell that's related to anatomy and how it functions. Okay, organ physiology is how, for example, in this hypothalamus region, okay, is where some of the hormones, so here you see this brain right here, and this blue triangular region, I always refer to it as a triangular region that's kind of odd shape at the bottom of the brain. But that's the hypothalamus of the brain. This is where some of the hormones are made to control other endocrine organs of the body. It's kind of, hypothalamus has a lot of different functions. When we talk about it, when we get to the brain chapter, you'll see that it has, 7 or more functions that, that participate in all different activities of the body. So hypothalamus is a very critical part of the brain, and it even controls the pituitary gland. Okay, pituitary gland is this little blob right here. And the pituitary gland is one of the master glands of your endocrine system. Okay, if your pituitary gland doesn't work properly, a lot of your downstream endocrine organs won't work as they should. And this is something we'll talk about in chapter 18, the very first chapter we get to in AMP2. Okay, so systemic physiology is what talks about how organs communicate with each other for certain processes like digestion or activate muscular contraction for movements. Those involves multiple systems to work together. Okay, and we'll talk about how those works. Okay, muscle contraction for sure in this class, but for things like digestion, urinary system, all that stuff, that's for next semester. Pathophysiology is actually a class you will have to take, I think. Okay, after you're done here with anatomy, there's microbiology, anatomy, physiology 1 and 2, and I think most of you have to take pathophysiology. This is where they will talk about some common types of diseases associated with tissues and organ system, and we'll talk about a lot of these too. It's not all about diseases because this is not a pathophysiology class, but with each organ system that we talk about, we will mention a few of the common types of diseases that's associated with those tissues we are examining or looking at or discussing about. Okay. All right, so there are a total of 11 organ systems that we will talk about in AMP1 and AMP2. For the first semester, we will only talk about 4 of these, which are your integumentary system, skeletal, muscular, and nervous system. Integumentary system is mainly your skin. Okay, if you have never heard of what is integumentary, sounds like interrogative or something. No, but it's just skin mainly. Okay, things that protect your body. Okay, we'll talk about different layers of your skin, what allows your skin to feel different things. Okay, the nervous system itself is actually divided into 6 different chapters due to its high complexity. It's one of the most complex organ system of the 11. Okay, and yet we can't live without it. Okay, because the nervous system is a central control and command center of everything else. Okay, if your brain stops working, everything else stops working. Okay, so that's why we need to make sure we talk about each part of these separately, just because there's so many things the brain is in charge of. Okay, just talking about how neurons work alone is one whole chapter. So this is why we only go over 4 chapters in the first semester, because we have to divide the nervous system into so many chapters. The brain is actually involving different, a lot of different pathway for different types of cognitive functions. So that's what we have to talk about, all those different functions. Okay, some of it is for memory, some of it is for sensory, etc. Okay, the rest of the 7 organ systems we will discuss in AMP2. Now, you don't have to know the details of each of these organ systems for lecture and lab at this moment. Okay, you do have a lab called Organ Systems of the Body. You don't have to know details. I think in your lab notebook is only like 2 or 3 pages long. It's not that long. You just need to know the gist of what I wrote down here, okay, of what each organ system do. That's all I will ask with organ systems, okay? So again, like I said, integumentary system is mainly your skin, hair, nails, okay? We won't talk about nails too much. So mainly maybe 90% about skin and then 10% about hair when we get to integumentary system. How it protects us from, environmental hazards. Because if we were to walk around like a little muscle man without hair, without skin, we're actually very prone to infection without our skin. Our skin is the first physical barrier against any intruders or foreign particles that try to take over our body. Okay, so that's why we begin by talking about the integumentary system, the first system we'll go over, after we talk about all the cells and tissues and all that stuff. Okay, so skeletal, of course, is our bones, so that provides support and protection of other tissues. We'll talk about how it helps us store calcium. That's a main homeostasis relationship we'll talk about when we get to chapter 6 on the bones. How we actually can form blood cells within the bone. We won't go into it too much, but formation of blood cell is something we'll talk more about into the process in AMP2. For muscular system, we'll talk about, different types of movement it allows us to make, and that fact that, it can actually generate heat to maintain body temperature. This is why we shiver. Nervous system is what directs, like I said, is the main control center of our whole entire body. So it directs immediate responses to stimuli, coordinate other organ system. Okay. Endocrine system, main word there is hormones. Okay. So, we can talk to each other through microphone, through phones, through texting, okay? But your organs don't know how to talk, okay? But yet they need to communicate with each other. And hence how organ system communicate with each other is by signals. And those signals are in forms of hormones. So this is why we begin AMP2 by talking about the endocrine system first, because it is the core of how our organs and cells can communicate with each other. Cardiovascular system, very obviously, is your heart and blood, okay, for distribution of nutrients, waste, and important gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc. Lymphatic system is your immune system for fighting against infections and diseases. Respiratory system is where we will talk a lot about air exchange, okay, gas exchange. How does oxygen know where to go when you breathe in, and how does carbon dioxide know it's something we need to breathe out, okay? Digestive system is where we process and digest food. We'll have a whole chapter in AMP2 with metabolism. How do we turn the food we eat into energy or for other purposes, such as building proteins or fats, etc. The urinary system is where we can excrete a lot of wastes and also control water balance in the blood. This will be a major theme in the urinary system. Is how we can balance water concentration and also a lot of different ion concentration and salt concentration. And then we'll end AMP2 with reproductive system, going over gonads, okay, your sex organs, and how our sex cells are produced from your gonads, okay, and how some of those hormones drive the reproductive system for those purposes, okay? All right. So the first few chapters of the semester, we will go over the first 3 levels of structure, and that's why we don't get to the integumentary system until chapter 5. Okay. Now, the chapter 2 is where we will talk about the chemical level. Chapter 3 will talk about the cellular level. Chapter 4 is where we'll talk about the tissue level. Okay, so chapter 2 and 3 are basically your entire semester of General Biology 1, Bio 1406, all in a nutshell. So this is what I warned with my 1406 student is that, all that we talk about in this entire semester, know that it's going to be squished into 1 or 2 chapter when you get to AMP. So that's why it is very important that you understood the basics in expanded form when you were in 1406, and then when you come to AMP is now should be review material, and we'll go over that pretty quickly from in chapter 2 and 3. So for the chemical level, we will discuss a bit about atoms and molecules, type of bonds they make, and the 4 basic macromolecules of life again. We actually spent a whole chapter on this in 1406, talking about carbohydrate, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. For cellular level, we will review the organelle functions, cell divisions, cancer, protein synthesis, and cell transport, such as diffusion and osmosis. Okay, if osmosis was your least favorite topic, you can't get away with osmosis, unfortunately. We'll talk about osmosis in AMP1, and we'll talk about osmosis in AMP2. It's one of the main things that you have to understand as a healthcare professional. One of the first things that I think, from what I hear anyway, that they teach you in nursing school is fluid electrolytes. And it's all about osmosis. How does osmosis work? Okay, if a patient is coming in dehydrated, what kind of saline solution do you put into their IV? If a patient is coming in hyperhydrated, what do you do? Okay, so that's what osmosis is very critical and important when we think about clinical setting. Okay. So if you have just recently taken BIOL 1406, then these two chapters should be very easy and straightforward for you, especially if you pass 1406 pretty easily, okay? The rest of the three levels of structures are organs, organ system, and organism, okay? So this diagram here just goes over the different hierarchy levels. So you have your atom level. Atoms make molecules, like I said, and from molecules you make cells, organelles, and then from organelles you make cells, from cells you make tissue, from tissue you make organ, and organ you make organ system, and then you get to a whole organism. Okay, so that's what this what we mean by 6 levels of structural hierarchy of organization in the body. We will be going over a lot of new terms related to anatomy and physiology these 2 semesters. One of the challenging parts with this class is being able to remember all these, okay, which may be foreign words you have never been exposed to before. So if you have to find in order to pass this class with, have an easier time remembering everything, you have to find a way that will help you remember all these words, or have an easier way to remember them. Sometimes I will talk about a funny story in lecture to help you remember certain words, but I can't do that for every single word out there. I don't know which word you're struggling to remember, but if you're finding yourself struggling to remember a certain disease name or certain part of the bone or a certain part of the muscle, think of a funny story that can help you remember the process. Okay, sometimes it is what triggers and stimulates your brain that's going to help you with memory, okay, versus just staring at the word and hopefully it will go into your brain by osmosis. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Okay, all right, so these medical terminologies that we will be talking a lot about is a special language that involves using root words, prefixes, suffixes, and combining forms to build terms related to the body in terms of health and diseases. So, for example, pathology is one word. The prefix path means disease. The suffix ology means study of. So, pathology, study of diseases, okay? Or microbiology, so study of microorganisms. Neurobiology, study of neurons. Okay, so that's why if you understand some of these prefixes and root words, it will help you remember, or sort of, if you forgot that word, what that means, it will help you kind of guess what that word means if you know some of these root words and prefixes. I will point those out throughout, AMP1 and AMP2 to help you kind of remember some of these important ones, or ones that we will for sure continuously and repetitively see in different chapters. So again, as we go throughout lecture, I will point out every now and then that something is a good root word to remember, because we will continuously see it in other chapters. Okay, so sometimes with these prefixes or root words, you may be able to guess, like I said, in terms of what they mean. Even if you don't entirely remember what it does. For example, a prefix we commonly see in AMP2 is hemo or hemato, okay? So that's a good prefix to remember. So usually when something begins with hemo or hemato, it usually means it has something to do with the blood. So if we're talking about a process called hemolysis, then that's something to do with blood. So blood, something. Well, lysis means breaking. So hemolysis, hemo means blood, lysis means breaking. So hemolysis must mean blood cells breaking apart. You can never mistake what hemolysis mean again. We'll talk about this when we get to osmosis, what happens to a cell when you dunk a red blood cell into high salt or low salt. One is where it will crenate, one is where it will be hemolyzed, okay? So some of my students always get confused between the two. So even if you don't know what crenation means, if you know what hemolysis means, then you know the opposite is crenation, which means shrinking of the red blood cells. So a lot of these clues will help you, okay? All right, so, or if we go back to hemato as a prefix, or if, let's say you read something about a technique called hematocrit. So you may not know exactly what it means yet, okay? It is actually a technique we'll talk about in AMP2 in the blood chapter, but at least you know it has something to do with blood because it begins with hemato, okay? So it's something with the blood that, you can sort of eliminate if it was a multiple choice or something, okay? So understanding these medical prefixes, suffixes, and root words may be able to help you a lot in remembering a lot of these different definitions. I will upload a copy of common prefixes, suffixes, and root words to eCampus for you to have a copy of and study on your own time if you like, especially if you are looking in to becoming a PA or a medical degree, etc. Because things are just going to be a lot faster and much more intensive in PA school and medical school. Now, these words weren't just made up by anyone. It actually is a global standard used by countries worldwide related to human anatomy. For example, my favorite muscle, which is gluteus maximus, is the main muscle of your rear end or your butt. So the the anatomical region is also called gluteal. Okay, and as you are memorizing these anatomical parts, I'm sure some of you will go through this struggle and think, who in the world named these things? Why are they so hard to remember? Well, people just didn't try to make our lives harder. That's what they come up with worldwide as an international effort. Okay. So that's why health profession is not an easy field to get into because it's a whole new language you have to learn in a sense. These anatomical terms are included in a publication called Terminologia Anatomica. Okay, so remember this, okay? Terminologia Anatomica. Oh, another thing about my lecture slides is that my lecture slides are very detailed because some of my students don't like to read the book. And my lecture slides are meant so that, it is easy to study. These are slides that are written by me. So I wrote it as if I'm the student and I'm taking notes in the chapter and I'm jotting down what's important from that chapter in these PowerPoint slides. So treat my PowerPoint slides as your best study guides, okay? Because, students always ask me, oh, can you give us a study guide? Well, my PowerPoint slide itself is the best study guide because I took these and wrote these from the textbook as if I'm the student, that I have to learn everything from the book myself, what I'm going to write if I was a student trying to study for an exam. Okay, so that's why my study guide is my PowerPoint slides is the best study guide for you. So whenever I bold and underline words, that usually means it's something important. So make sure you remember those bold underline words. Okay, so this was published since 1998, the Terminologia Anatomica, which is the worldwide standard for human anatomical terminology. And it was put together by these two organizations here internationally. And, in a sense, it makes sense because regardless where you go, you still want the gluteal to mean your rear end anywhere you go. So that even though we are communicating in different languages, but if we talk about those medical terms, everybody in that room understand. Let's say a surgical room or something. Everybody in that surgical room, even though it's in Iran, in Europe, in Asia, wherever it is, they understand where exactly you're talking about on the body, and you will not cut the wrong part. Okay, so that's why it's an international standard, so that everyone in the world know which body part you're talking about when you're trying to save a person at a hospital. All right, and hence we will go over some of the basic anatomical terms for body regions, relative positions, directions, body sections, as well as major body cavities and their subdivisions as well for chapter 1, like I said, as a first dip into anatomy and physiology. Now, the standard reference body position for naming things, because I did say we're going to learn how to name different orientation of the body. So how do we make sure that we're talking about, because a body laying down can be in any format it is, and everybody can put the body in a different way. So there is a standard reference body position in how we name these directional terms, okay? So this standard reference body position for humans is called the anatomical position, where your hands or the body's hands should be at their sides like this, with palms facing forward, okay, facing forward, and feet are together like this. So this is your anatomical position, okay? Anatomical position with your hands on the sides, palms facing forward. There are 4 ways to describe which view of the anatomical position we are looking at. So you have your anterior view, which is this frontal view right here. So this is your anterior view looking at the front side of the body. Posterior view is looking at the back side of the body. So anterior view, posterior view. Supine means that the body is laying face upwards, okay? Prone position is where the body is laying face down. I guess, for the case of forensics, this is where then it becomes critical how they found the body as at a crime scene or murder scene or whatever it is, how the body is laid down, relative to what we know as the body anatomical position, okay? All right. So don't worry about, now you see all these little frontal, nasal, axillary, those are called anatomical landmarks. Okay, I'm going to put body landmarks. Okay, you'll see them called as regions as well, but I don't want to, confuse you with what we're going to talk about, abdominal pelvic regions. I'm just going to call these body landmarks like your, lab manual kind of refers them to. So I won't test you on any of these body landmarks for lecture. So don't try to memorize all these parts when you're studying for a lecture exam. But we will talk about it when we get to your lab. Your first lab is one of the job is to locate and know all these body landmarks. So you save this body landmark stuff for a lab, okay? But for a lecture exam, I won't ask you that. I will test you on the body landmarks, whether you can name a certain parts of the body by their body landmark name on the lab practical. So you will be asked to familiarize yourself with these parts in lab 1, okay? All right, so there are 5 sets of anatomical directions you have to know. These are pretty straightforward in terms of definition. But make sure that you have to know how to apply these directional terms on the lecture exam and lab practical, because on the lecture exam or lab practical, I'm not asking for definitions of these directional terms. I'm asking for applications of them. Okay, for example, what is the eye relative to the nose? Or what is the lungs relative to the heart in terms of anatomical direction? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll start with superior and inferior. Superior means something above, okay, superior, and inferior means something below. So an example could be the nose is superior to the mouth, okay, or the head is superior to the body, or we can say, your forehead is superior to your chin. Something that's on top of 3-dimensional wise, okay, is what we mean by superior, inferior, okay? Or we can also say the liver is inferior to your diaphragm, below your diaphragm, okay? Medial and lateral means something that's toward the midline of the body or away from the midline of the body. So if it's towards the midline of the body, we call it medial. Okay, easy way to remember, medial, towards middle part of your body. Okay, towards the middle. Lateral is when it's going away from the midline of the body. So medial is towards the midline. Lateral is away from the midline. I think a lot of people get confused with this set of term, medial, lateral, and usually proximal, distal. Okay, so medial, lateral, if we use it in application, for example, the sternum is medial to the ribs. Okay, remember the sternum is actually the central bone right here in the middle of your chest area. Okay, and your ribs, of course, is all over here. Okay, so the sternum is, relatively speaking, in the middle of your ribs, okay, in between your ribs. So that's why we say the sternum is medial to the ribs. The other way around, we would say the ribs is lateral to the sternum. Okay, so something to the side of or in the middle of. Okay, so if it's something that's in the middle of, we'll call it medial. If it's something to the side of, we'll call it lateral. So, if these words are confusing you when you are working on your exam or lab practical, or as you're studying and doing your homework, just try to plug in your normal words, okay? If I'm asking ears to your nose, okay, is my ears the side of my nose or in between my nose? Well, my ears can't be in between my nose, okay? So the ears are to the side of your nose, which means your ears are lateral to your nose, okay? So put in your normal directional everyday life terms in there, then you know which anatomical directional term to put in there. Okay. All right. And then you have dorsal versus ventral. Dorsal means the back side of the body. Ventral means the belly side of the body. So this is for humans is actually the same as anterior and posterior. Okay, we make the distinction of anterior, posterior versus dorsal and ventral when we talk about an animal, a four-legged animal, for example. We're not doing dissections because it's an online class, but when we do in-person lab, we will actually have cats. We were thinking about doing a cat, but we usually use minks. And with those things, we talk about dorsal versus ventral side of the animal versus anterior and posterior side, okay? Because their anterior side is their face, whereas the belly side is actually with the animal belly side up, okay? So that's ventral. So for humans, it doesn't matter anterior versus anterior or posterior. So anterior means the same as ventral because our belly is also facing forward. Posterior is the back, okay, which means the same thing as dorsal because our back is facing backwards, okay? But for a four-legged animal, if you want me to draw it, okay, so here's the animal. Excuse me for my bad drawing. Okay, so here's an animal, 4 legs. Okay, so this is the anterior part of the animal. This is the posterior part of the animal, the butt part. Okay, but if we're referring to their back, then that's the dorsal side of the animal, and their tummy side is that side. Okay, ventral side of the animal. So that's why I say it makes a difference whether we're talking about humans versus an animal in terms of dorsal versus ventral. Okay, so the next set is proximal versus distal. Proximal, easy way to remember it. Proximal sounds like proximate. Okay, so something that's close to, okay, closer to the trunk of your body or attached end, okay, the attached end farther away from the trunk. So if it's closer to the trunk of your body, we call it proximal. If it's farther from the trunk of the body, we call it distal, okay? So something that's proximate, closer, or distant away, okay? Farther away from the trunk of the body. So usually when we talk about proximal and distal, we're talking about something attached to a joint. Okay, for example, we talk about knees. So if we're talking about knees relative to your toes. Well, if we think about knees, which is right here, okay, this is the trunk of the body. Okay, this is the trunk of the body. Knees versus your toes. So which is closer to the trunk of the body? Your knees. Okay, so knees then is proximal to the toes. Okay, because knees is closer to the trunk of the body than your toes. Okay, so always think about the trunk of your body when we talk about proximal versus distal. Okay, like I said, students usually have a hard time with proximal, distal versus medial and lateral. Make sure you have good practice of these two directional set terms. Okay. Another good example would be your wrist compared with your elbows. Okay, so if I ask your wrist relative to your elbow, your wrist is distal to your elbow because it's farther away from the trunk of your body. Your wrist is right here, your elbow is right here, and this is the trunk of your body. Your wrist is closer to the trunk of the body. Your elbow is closer to the trunk of the body than your wrist. Okay, so the wrist is distal to the elbow, or the other way around, the elbow is proximal to the wrist. Okay, so then last set of directional term is superficial versus deep. Okay, this is meaning toward or at the body surface, meaning very close to the surface. That's why superficial, meaning it is, right on top of the body, close to the top of the body, or away from the body surface, which is deep. Okay, deep into your tissues. Okay, so for example, if we're talking about lungs relative to your rib cage, your lungs is not outside of your rib cage. Your lungs are underneath your rib cage. So you would say lungs are deep to the rib cage. Okay, so note that some of these, directional terms are interchangeable. So sometimes you can use anterior or superficial, okay, depending on the case. I might take either or, but if it's a multiple choice, I'll make sure that these don't overlap. But for lab practical, it's short answers. So whichever one you put that makes sense, I will still give you credit. So know that some of these may seem to overlap. And that's what students are usually in lab one, like, oh, I thought, this would make sense too, and I say, yeah, sure, that sure makes sense, because some of these are interchangeable. Depends how, what parts are we talking about. Okay. All right, so make sure you know how to apply these. I'm not going to ask for definition on the exam. I'm going to ask for a body part relative to another body part. Stick a anatomical directional term in between there. Okay. All right. Because there are many different organs within the abdominal pelvic cavity, it is divided into different spaces to refer to a particular abdominal pelvic area. So there are two ways to map the surface of your abdominal pelvic area. Either by quadrants or by regions. Abdominal quadrants are actually very easy to remember. It's just by direction. Okay, so if it's now the only thing that can confuse you is the right and left side. Okay, so what we're used to saying is, okay, this is my right. Okay, so I'm going to call this right side, this left side. Make sure that whenever we're talking about body region, it is always relative to the person we're looking at. When you're talking to a person, you're not talking to, when you as a health profession talking to a patient, you're not talking about yourself. You're talking about the patient. So that's why you have to talk about these terms in terms of the direction of the patient. So you're staring at the patient's body, and this side is the right side of the patient's body. This side is the left side of the patient's body. Okay, so this is the right, this is the left. So make sure it's your other right if you're looking at something and thinking whether it's right or left. Okay, other than that, the quadrants are very easy to remember. This is the right upper quadrant because what they do is how they divide the abdominal pelvic quadrant is by two imaginary perpendicular lines that intersect at the belly button. So here's the belly button and here's your two lines. Okay, so this is the right upper quadrant, this is the right lower quadrant, this is the left upper quadrant, and this is the left lower quadrant. Okay, so very easy. No special words to remember, just directional terms that make sense. Now, why these abdominal pelvic area is divided into these different nomenclature is that, for example, when a medical examiner or other health profession records, where it's supposed to state where the patient is feeling pain, this provide a standard reference in what they will write, and everyone will understand what general location of the abdomen that health professional was referring to. So anybody that read that health record of what you examine in the patient, or where the patient was describing they were feeling uncomfortable at, by reading health record, where, just about where they're talking about if you use these quadrant terms or these region terms. For clinicians, they can also utilize these information to determine possible cause of pain or discomfort. For example, tenderness in the right lower quadrant right here usually is a symptom of appendicitis, because your appendix is about right here. Okay, the region between your small intestines and your large intestine is where the appendix is, and that's in this little region right there. So that's why pain or severe pain in this area usually has a good indication of appendicitis. Not that it is for sure it's appendicitis, but it is a good indication of that. Okay, so the other method divides the abdominal pelvic area into 9 quadrants, kind of like tic-tac-toe, okay, going through the top, middle, bottom, either you're on the left, middle, or the right side of the abdomen. So here is called the right hypochondriac region, epigastric region, left hypochondriac region. So there's no one word for all 9 little squares, okay? You just have to remember hypochondriac is the upper part, lumbar is the middle part, inguinal is the lower part, okay? And you actually have to know the word inguinal because that's one of the body landmarks you will learn in lab. So inguinal should give you a pretty good idea that is somewhere in the pelvic area. Okay, so right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, right lumbar region, left lumbar region, right inguinal region, left inguinal region, and then the middle is the special words. Okay, somewhere by the belly button is where the umbilical cord was attached to, so that's why they call this region the umbilical region. So that's an easy way to remember it. And then epigastric region, something that's on top of the umbilical region. Hypogastric region is underneath the umbilical. Okay. All right. So make sure you know the names of these 9 abdominal pelvic region. And you will review these again in lab 1. Now, this figure here is another important figure to know the gist of where the abdominal organs are. For example, the stomach's here, the liver's here. On the lab practical, I might ask, name an organ that resides in the umbilical region, or name an organ that resides in the right hypochondriac region. So that's why you need to know the gist of where these organs are relative to either the regions or quadrant. Okay, I can also ask, name an organ that is residing in the left upper quadrant. Okay, so that's how you will be tested on knowing these areas. Okay, I could ask the name of the parts or the organs underneath, and you will review these again in lab 1. Now, other than body regions and directions, we will also have to know the basic terminologies for different sections and planes. A lot of the imaging techniques we will be discussing in the last bit of this chapter views the body in sections. A section means it is a slice through a 3-dimensional object. For example, if you have a sphere, you put a slice through it, you have a circle. Okay, you have a cylinder. Okay, you put a slice through it, it's still a circle. Okay, so that's what a section means. Okay, the section is the cut itself, and the view of the specific cut produces is called a sectional plane, a sectional plane. So this sectional plane is that two-dimensional flat surface view I was talking about that produces that circle. So for example, in both of these pictures here, in this picture and this picture here, you're seeing a section of the abdominal area through either the CT scan or the MRI. So, and this, of course, is a PET scan of a section of the brain. So these is looking at certain plane of the body due to the sectioning of the body as it's going through, and sort of, in a sense, taking slices of pictures through your body. Okay, so that's why we have to talk about these sections and planes. And we can define these sections and planes by how the body was cut or image. Okay, so the frontal plane means that it is the vertical plane that divides the body into the interior and posterior portion. So this purple one right here is called a frontal plane. Okay, so this is a frontal cut or frontal view of plane view of the body. Okay. Sagittal plane is that vertical cut, okay, that divides the body into left and right portion. Okay, so the left and right portion of the body is divided by your sagittal plane. So a cut in this plane is called a sagittal section, and this is what we usually a lot of times see images or anatomical models too, that they are showing the sagittal section of the head or of the torso. So a plane that lies in the middle, like smack in the middle of the body, is called mid-sagittal plane. That's why it's called mid right here, because it's right in the middle of the body. That's where it was cut. Okay. And then you have transverse plane, which divides the body into superior portion and inferior portion. Okay, so transverse plane is this green one right here. Okay, and a cut in the plane is called a transverse section, which was what we were looking at in terms of the brain's PET scan or the abdominal CT and MRI scan earlier in the last slide. Those are actually transverse section of the body, or viewing them as transverse planes. Okay. It's kind of hard to, envision this, on a two-dimensional picture. So I'll show you a quick video that goes over these sectional anatomies by animation. And sometimes, that makes it easier for you to remember and visualize what's going on with these three different planes and sections of the body.
Studying the human...
Okay.
Anatomy requires an understanding of the anatomical planes. These planes are used to describe the location of structures and the types of cuts that are made to view structures. A plane can be described as a 2D slice in a 3D space. Imagine a sheet of glass slicing across an upright human body in X, Y, and Z axis. This is what we refer to as anatomical planes. It helps us to describe or localize a structure in the body. Medical imaging modalities such as computed tomography or magnetic resonance often use these terms to describe the scans taken in flat slices. There are three cardinal anatomical planes. The mid-sagittal or median plane is a vertical plane that divides the body symmetrically into right and left parts. The coronal or frontal plane is also a vertical plane, but divides the body into front and back parts. The transverse plane is a horizontal plane that divides the body into top and bottom parts. You can learn more about these terminologies through our published lectures.
Okay, so it's been an hour, so let's take a break here, and we will continue with part 2 of chapter 1 in a bit.